And let's look at how it is that species form. We've talked about lots of ways in which selection, natural, artificial, or sexual, can influence species, but how does it make new species? The modern story starts in 1928 with this German ornithologist, shown here on the right, with his Malay assistant Sadio on the left, going off to New Guinea to collect, study, and classify a family of birds known as the Paradisidae, the birds of paradise. There was a bit of a commercial interest in this because this is the era when um, it was stylish for women to wear rather elaborate hats, and a popular decoration for fashionable ladies' hats was the very long feathers of certain members of this bird family, the birds of paradise, which have unusually colorful and beautiful and sometimes quite striking plumage. In fact, here's one in flight. You can see how those tail feathers are really quite something. Now, birds of paradise feathers at the time were acquired by indigenous people in places like Malaysia, Indonesia, and Papua New Guinea. They would be given guns. They'd shoot birds of paradise and sell the skins to traders who would sell them to middlemen who would import them to Europe. And certain varieties of birds of paradise were more valuable than others. So there's a bit of commercial interest here in trying to figure out how many different species of birds of paradise there actually might be. And Meyer ended up shooting and skinning over 3,000 birds. You really can't get away with this sort of thing now. It was, let's just say, it was a different time back then. But when we define species, very often it's done just on the basis of a couple of specimens. But members of a species vary, as they always do. And large scale sampling like this, I don't want to say it was the best way to do science, but it did give Meyer a sense of the range of variation that you find among species of birds of paradise. And his problem was that he couldn't figure out how to divide that range of variation. This is Dicrurus paradiseus, and you can see in different areas, different populations of this bird looked different. Certainly they look different in the amount of feathers that they've got on that crest that they have. And they vary, but it wasn't obvious how to neatly divide Dicrurus paradiseus up. Do we have many different species here? Do we have just one, but it happens to be very variable? How do you divide them up? How do you, as someone once said, carve nature at the joints? Is there a natural way in which you can take all this range and divide it? Meyer went on to becoming one of the grand old men of evolution. He died at the age of, I think it was 101 in, I think, 2005, had a very long career, ended up at Harvard as not just a bird specialist, but a historian and philosopher of science. What he realized on the basis of his studies of the birds of paradise was that you couldn't define species purely on their shape or their color, on length of feathers, or anything like that. And what he devised is now just called the biological species concept. And this is the basic definition of what is a species that you probably learned in 1440 or 1441. A species is a set of populations that potentially interbreed. Two species are separate if their members cannot interbreed successfully. If they can interbreed successfully, they are the same species. You probably learned about this with the example of horses and donkeys. Horses and donkeys can interbreed, but it's not successful because the offspring are sterile. You cross a horse and a donkey, and what you get is a mule, of course. So we consider horses and donkeys to be separate species because they cannot interbreed and produce fertile offspring. That's all Meyer. Meyer also went on to propose a model for how it is that new species form. This is not the only way, as we'll see, that new species can form, but it's an important way, and it's called allopatric speciation. Patria is Latin for your native land, your fatherland. That is your patria. If you love your patria, you are patriotic, right? So your patria is your homeland. Allos is Greek for different, as in allele, for example, different forms of a gene. And allopatric speciation requires a species' native range to get divided. It starts with a population of one species getting split into two or more populations by a barrier that individuals can't easily get across. One way this could happen is you have a population living in an area, and then some members of that population migrate to a new habitat across a barrier that they don't normally cross. And we call that dispersal. Example, the Galapagos Islands are 600 miles off the coast of Ecuador. Little finches don't normally fly 600 miles across open water, but possibly there was a storm at some point in the past that blew some finches to the Galapagos and they were able to survive there. Yeah, you'd get this a lot on island chains. Oh, if you want a recent example, there was actually a new volcanic island off the coast of Iceland called Surtsey that was created in a volcanic eruption in 1963. When Surtsey formed, it was completely barren. I mean, it was, you know, lava rock and volcanic ash. Now it has something like 80 species of plants on it, as well as insects and spiders and even earthworms. And what has happened is that those have all drifted across the ocean, sometimes in the form of seeds. Sometimes spiders and insects have been blown there by wind. The earthworms got transported in the soil surrounding the roots of a tree that had washed out to sea and drifted up onto the shores. And so all these populations are now established and stable on the island of Surtsey, which didn't have them as far back as 1963. That's dispersal. The other possibility is that the organisms do not move themselves. They stay where they are, but a barrier arises within the range of the population. It could be a mountain range goes up. It could be a continent rifts apart. We'll talk about plate tectonics later. In the case of some fish off in the desert that I have known about and studied a little bit, it could be that they're living in populations connected by a river and then the river dries up. It could be a change in the course of river circulation or something like that. If the organisms don't move, but a barrier arises and splits the range of the population, we call that vicariance. So a population can get split either by dispersal or by vicariance. The separate populations will tend to become different from each other. One is that the populations may end up in different environments and be subject to different selective pressures. If a group of birds is adapted for living in jungles, but a population of them gets blown to an island that's a lot more dry, The birds will be subject to selective pressure. If they survive, they'll end up being modified. You also have the fact that alleles in one population can't be exchanged with alleles in the other. So any mutant alleles that appear in one won't make it into the other. We say that gene flow is blocked. Yet another factor that's not on this slide is that if both the separate populations are small, genetic drift will tend to make them different from each other. One population may lose certain alleles that the other one had. A fourth thing is that purely by the luck of the draw, one population may have an unusually high or unusually low frequency of certain alleles, and we call this the founder effect. So all four of those things are going to tend to make those separated populations different from each other. Given enough time, they may become so different from each other that even if the barrier disappears and the two populations come back into contact, they will not interbreed. And if that happens, we can truly say that we have separate species now. Here's just a few examples of the founder effect. These, by the way, are not associated with human speciation. Humans have not speciated. We're all one species and we're all perfectly capable of interbreeding with each other. But this is an example of the founder effect. These are the hands of a sufferer of a disease. It affects your iron metabolism. It's called porphyria. It can cause skin lesions, digestive problems, and it can cause mental disturbance. King George III of Great Britain is thought to have suffered from porphyria. You might remember that this was the king that Erasmus Darwin was asked to be his doctor because the king was having these bouts where he would, not know where he was, and he was getting into screaming matches with trees. And Erasmus Darwin was picked to treat him and turned down the job. He may have had porphyria, although I don't think anybody's absolutely sure. Oh, by the way, the UK made a movie, very good movie, about this called The Madness of George III. When they released it in the United States, they had to change the title to The Madness of King George because Americans saw the title, The Madness of George III, and wondered where the first two parts of the movie were. Right? They thought it was The Madness of George Part 3. Anyway, I digress. There's a form of porphyria that happens to be unusually common among the Dutch population of South Africa, the Cape Dutch. And the reason is that that Dutch population was founded by a small number of migrants from the Netherlands. As is fairly typical, most of the migrants were men, and to get wives for them, governments back in Europe emptied out the orphanages and sent, young girls of marriageable age over to the colonies with the instruction, find a husband and breed us a bunch of taxpayers. They did that in Louisiana, and I assume they did that here as well, because an orphan who came over in 1688, Ariantia Adrianza, just happened, just by dumb luck, to be a carrier of porphyria. She had kids, the kids had kids, their kids had kids, and eventually, given enough time, distant descendants of Ariantia Adrianza are going to be marrying each other once it's been long enough that they forget that they're related. And once that starts happening, you start seeing an incidence of people born homozygous for these alleles that develop porphyria. Here's another one for you. This is an old map of Massachusetts. Boston is kind of over here. You can't quite see it on this map. This land right here is Cape Cod, which comes all the way up all the way up to here, more or less like that. So Salem and is up here. This island right here is the island of Nantucket, famous in American poetry. You've no doubt heard there once was a man from Nantucket who kept all his cash in a bucket. His daughter, named Nan, ran off with a man, and as for that bucket, Nantucket. Anyway, there's Nantucket. This is an island called Martha's Vineyard. And in this day and age, it is home to some of the priciest real estate in the country. Like, this is where you go shopping if you want a really nice vacation home and you happen to be Bill Gates or some other very high level business executive. There are, multi-million dollar vacation getaways on Martha's Vineyard. But that's pretty recent. Up until fairly recently, Martha's Vineyard was kind of off the beaten path. The locals made a living through mostly they were fishermen. They didn't cross to the mainland that often. I mean, they could, but they didn't mingle with them that much. So it's a semi-isolated human population. And the incidence of congenital deafness was as high as 1 in 155, more than 0.5%. In one town, it was 4%. 1 in 25 people was congenitally deaf. As opposed to in America in general, it was about 1 in 5,700 people. Now, deafness can have multiple causes, but there are at least some forms that are transmitted genetically. And it looks like that a few of the colonial settlers who would have settled, I think, beginning in the early 1600s, were either deaf themselves or they were carriers of the allele. And so most of them would have stayed mostly on Martha's Vineyard, married spouses from Martha's Vineyard, raised their kids on Martha's Vineyard. After several generations of this, descendants of whatever colonist it was who was first to carry the allele start marrying each other, maybe not consciously. And what you end up with is more and more people that are homozygous for alleles that confer congenital deafness. And there's not a huge amount of gene flow between Martha's Vineyard and the mainland, or at least there wasn't 200 years ago. There's quite a bit more now. Incidentally, a reason this matters in US history is that in Martha's Vineyard, and there was actually another town in Vermont that was in the same situation, kind of an isolated settlement with a high degree of congenital deafness. People developed other ways to speak. And in particular, the Martha's Vineyard settlers developed a means of communicating amongst themselves with signs. And in fact, even some of the hearing population of Martha's Vineyard learned the sign language in order to communicate with them. If you own a shop on Martha's Vineyard and some of your customers are deaf, it's probably good business if you learn at least enough to be able to sign, "Can I help you?" And that will be $2. And, that's part of our spring clearance or whatever it is that you need to say. So in the early 19th century, a fellow named Albert Galladay had learned French Sign Language. He'd gone to France and learned about methods of deaf education. And he founded a boarding school that brought in deaf students from all over the early US, but in particular Martha's Vineyard. And so French Sign Language cross-fertilized with Martha's Vineyard sign and the sign language that had developed in a few other places like that town in Vermont. That's the roots of ASL, of American Sign Language. And it developed in the way it did in part because one of ASL's ancestors was Martha's Vineyard sign, which developed because there was this unusually high deaf population because of the founder effect. Oh, what the heck. I just thought of an example from around where I'm from. I grew up in Lafayette, Louisiana, and a bit north and to the west of me, we've got towns that are, originally French speaking, settled mostly by Cajuns. They're not really in the swamp. North and west of me, it's mostly prairie. But towns like Eunice, who we always used to beat in football, and Kinder, and oh, I can't even remember what all of them are called. I think this is in the 1970s. There was a case of a baby that was born and did fine for about the first 6 months and then just started failing. And somehow the case drew the attention of a doctor from New York who recognized it as a genetic disease called Tay-Sachs syndrome. Now, Tay-Sachs is normally something that's at its highest levels in Jews of Eastern European descent. In fact, synagogues in areas with a high Jewish population will actually sponsor genetic testing because if you're a carrier of this, you may not want to have kids because babies with Tay-Sachs syndrome die by the age of 4. It's a slow, progressive loss of nervous system function, and it's not at all pretty. So what the heck is it doing in South Louisiana? Well, it looks like one of the early settlers, maybe back in the 1700s, just so happened to be a carrier of Tay-Sachs and settled down somewhere in the vicinity of Eunice, Louisiana, and had kids, and they had kids, and they had kids, and so on. And what you end up with is, in a region of the US that was pretty isolated for a long time, they didn't get roads until the 30s. People tended to marry people that lived close by, and that means marrying people that are related to you. And that led to a number of babies born with Tay-Sachs syndrome. And it turned out this had been recognized for a long time, but nobody knew what to call it. They just knew that sometimes your baby is born and then they just get something wrong and they can't live. So that would be another case of the founder effect. There's lots of instances of this where one semi-isolated human population tends to have a high incidence of some otherwise rare genetic trait or condition. You get this in the animal kingdom as well, and this is a recent example. This is the Argentine ant, Linapithema humuli. They live in colonies, and ants from different colonies taste different. Different colonies have different hydrocarbons on the exoskeleton. Ants from genetically different colonies attack each other because they can sense different hydrocarbons. They taste different. Now, Linapithema humuli has been introduced all over the world to California, the Eastern US, Europe, Japan, Australia. And in part because of the founder effect, Linapithema humuli in California, colonies don't attack each other because they're so genetically similar to each other. And that's probably because they all come from one founder colony that got introduced to California maybe 100 years ago or so. And what this has led to is the development of super colonies, sets of interconnected colonies that freely exchange workers. There's a super colony in California. The largest is 3,600 miles long across the Mediterranean coast from Portugal to Turkey. There's a big super colony in the Southeast US. Yeah, apparently we have super colonies in Arkansas. They've been established in Japan, in the Persian Gulf, in South Africa, in elsewhere in South America, worldwide. And part of this ability to form super colonies is ultimately the founder effect, because these new colonies where they've been introduced, those colonies don't contain a lot of genetic diversity, which means that all of the colonies that bud from them are genetically very nearly the same close enough so that different colonies don't attack each other. So the Galapagos finches would probably be an example of speciation by dispersal. Again, finches are little birds. They're not normally going to disperse over 600 miles of open water. They might have been blown across by a storm. We may never know exactly how they got there, but they don't cross today, certainly not very often. It must be quite rare. And then these finches must have dispersed again from one island to the next. Bear in mind that the Galapagos are active volcanoes, and we think that these finches must have colonized the oldest islands and then been able to migrate to newer islands as those islands were forming. Right? The Galapagos did not all form at exactly the same time. So there's been dispersal within the Galapagos Islands, and that's what gives you separated populations of finches, each one of which has evolved into a new species. And the same would be true for the Galapagos mockingbirds and prickly pear cactus and everything else. On the other hand, this is my personal favorite. 10,000 years ago, the Mojave Desert of Southern California and Southern Nevada was actually not a desert. In fact, we've mapped, there used to be a sizable river that connected a system of lakes lying between mountain ranges in what didn't used to be a desert. It was a lot wetter. What has happened in the Mojave is the climate has changed, as climates do, not usually as drastically as we're making it do, but climates do shift. And the lakes are almost completely gone, and the rivers that connected them now run dry. There's a lot of completely dry river channels in the Mojave Desert. The largest river in the Mojave might only have water at the surface maybe for 1 month out of the year, and sometimes not even that much. So what's happened is, with the lakes all dried up and the rivers all dried up, populations of desert fish have only survived in tiny pockets of wetlands fed by spring water. That's the only way you can get, a permanent pond or lake on the surface of the land, is if it's fed by spring water. And within these little isolated springs, we have populations of pupfish that have evolved into separate species. Down below, those are little pupfish. They're about 1 inch long. A lot of fun to watch because the males are this brilliant blue, and you can sit at the edge of one of these desert springs and watch them feed, and the males are just constantly hitting on the females when they're not chasing each other off. Just watching them is like watching the most hormonally charged meat market bar you've ever been in. The males are doing this equivalent of, hey, hey, baby, hey, 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 baby, over here. Hey, can I get your number? Hey, hey, baby, you got beautiful eyes. Can I get your number? Hey, you back off. Hey, she's mine. Hey, hey, baby, hey, hey, hey. It's like, yeah, I can remember some college frat parties that had that kind of vibe, and maybe some of you can too. Yeah, the male pupfish are this bright blue and constantly on the make. And below, that's one from a place called Ash Meadows outside the town of Pahrump, which rhymes with dump, Nevada. Up at the top, that's a different species adapted to a different habitat and with different colors and different, tooth shape and things like that, from Salt Creek within the borders of Death Valley National Park. And if you go around the American and Mexican West, there's something like 20 species of desert pupfish that all made it into the desert at the time when it wasn't a desert, and you had lakes and rivers for them to disperse. And then they all got trapped as the climate shifted and streams dried up, rivers dry up, and then most of the lakes dried up except for a few little pockets. And in those pockets, we have isolated populations that can now no longer mingle because they're separated by 100 flippin' miles of desert. And each of those populations has evolved into a separate species. 4 different species of pupfish in the Mojave, and again, 20 if you look at northern Mexico and the western US, from northern California all the way to West Texas. Can we actually see this happening? Well, there was kind of an accidental experiment along these lines. Clamworms are a type of marine segmented worm. So they're distantly related to earthworms. Clamworms they look a little like earthworms, but they've got little paddles on each of the segments. Many of them are quite active swimmers or crawlers. They use them as bait out there. And they're relatively easy to raise in a lab. And so a colony of clamworms was collected from the ocean in 1964 at Long Beach, raised in a laboratory. And in 1986, 4 pairs of those captive worms were brought across the country to Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, WHOI, at Woods Hole, Massachusetts, and raised in a lab there. Now, there wasn't actual selection going on. They were, being raised for convenience, but nobody was trying to breed new varieties or anything. But in 1992, a couple of people tried to crossbreed Woods Hole worms with worms collected from Long Beach, and they failed. There's a clamworm for you. This is another one of those species where the male does a lot of the parental care. They build nests. Females lay their eggs in these nests. Males follow and fertilize the eggs. And then males sit on top of the eggs and fan them, use those paddle-like appendages that they've got to keep oxygenated water flowing over the eggs, and clean the eggs with their mouths to keep fungus from growing on them. Males wouldn't take care of hybrid eggs, and the eggs were all destroyed by fungus infection and lack of oxygen. Okay, that's no big deal because you can artificially rear these eggs just by putting a little, air stone, a little bubble stone into the tank and letting the stream of bubbles pass over the eggs. That cleans them and it keeps them oxygenated. But even when this was done, they failed to develop. There is something about those separated populations of clamworm that make them genetically incompatible with each other. Exactly what, I'm not sure we know, but there's something about it that makes these 2 populations of worms no longer able to interbreed, both because males won't raise hybrid offspring, and because even if you artificially rear the eggs, the embryos don't develop right. By the biological species concept, we now have, over the past 35 years, we've developed 2 new worm species, and we'd refer to these as cryptic species. Cryptic species are separate by the biological species concept, but they don't necessarily, well, not necessarily, they don't look like each other. You can't tell them apart by looking, but even though you can't tell them apart by looking, we still call them separate species because they are not capable of interbreeding. It's nice when separate species look different from each other, but they don't have to. The biological species concept is based on what we call reproductive isolation. And reproductive isolation can be either pre-zygotic or post-zygotic. Now, zygotic, of course, means having to do with a zygote being a fertilized egg. I assume you're familiar with that term. Prezygotic isolation is anything that can happen to stop interbreeding before Mr. Sperm meets Mrs. Egg. So you can have behavioral isolation, for example, where individuals don't interbreed because they've got very different mate recognition behaviors. If the male bird is singing tweet, 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 and the female bird has to hear chirp, chirp, chirp in order to get into the mood, the two of them are never going to interbreed. They've got different mate recognition behaviors. You can have temporal isolation where individuals don't interbreed because they mature at different times. If one flower opens its petals in April and a second flower opens its petals in June, by which time the April flower has completely faded, then the two will never interbreed because they're ready to reproduce at incompatible times. You can have ecological isolation where individuals don't interbreed because they live in different niches. You can have a lot of mechanisms of gametic isolation where individuals don't interbreed because there's some kind of biochemical incompatibility between gametes. With plants, if the pollen of one species lands on the stigma, the sticky pad in the center of a flower of a different species, very often the pollen just simply won't germinate, will never grow its pollen tube, and will never fertilize the egg way down in the middle of the flower. With marine invertebrates, there's a lot of protein level recognition that has to go on. Where if the sperm has the wrong receptor proteins, the sperm won't be able to penetrate the egg. There can be all kinds of incompatibilities on a chemical level between egg and sperm, or sometimes between egg or sperm and the parental tissues. Two individuals might not be able to interbreed because her immune system successfully kills off all of his sperm, for example. That can happen. There's even mechanical isolation. A lot of species of insects, crustaceans, and other arthropods have very complicated male sex organs with rather complex shapes and various attachments, that can almost look like Swiss Army knives. I think I mentioned earlier that dragonflies have these spoon-shaped attachments on their penises for scraping out the sperm of rival males. That's not that uncommon. And the male and female sex organs will fit together literally like a key and a lock. Different species may simply not fit. Even if they do attempt to interbreed, it may simply be impossible because his won't fit into hers. There's even been cases where attempted hybridization has resulted in the male's tallywhacker snapping off, after which he's no longer able to reproduce with anybody, taking him right out of the evolutionary game. So you can have mechanical isolation where two individuals can't interbreed because their genitalia do not physically fit together. It happens. And then finally, postzygotic isolation is due to everything that happens after sperm meets egg. Sometimes the egg may be fertilized, it may form a zygote, but it can't develop any further. Sometimes development begins but then stops. One experiment people have done with frog eggs, you can get a frog egg to start developing and it will go through the early stages of division, and all you have to do is poke it with a dirty needle. It doesn't even have to be fertilized with a sperm. Those first few cell divisions are basically pre-programmed. The egg will go through them if anything pokes a hole in it. I love you, sweetie. Have a good time. You look beautiful, as always. Right, where was I? Those first few cell divisions are basically pre-programmed, but eventually there comes a point where the zygote's DNA from mom and dad has to be activated. And if the DNA doesn't work together properly, well, then what happens is that the embryo stops developing and dies after a certain point. So you get embryo inviability. Sometimes you get birth to term, but the offspring just can't survive. You can get hybrid sterility, where the hybrids may survive, but they can't breed. And finally, you can get reduced hybrid fitness, where the hybrids survive, but they're very poorly adapted. They may be prone to some kind of defects. They may be very weak. Um, if there's something wrong enough with the hybrids, then we call that a reproductive isolation mechanism. Okay, what's going on? Yeah, if two populations hybridize, but the hybrids have low fitness, natural selection will favor anything that decreases the incidence of hybridization. Think about this. If we have species A and species B living together, and every time species A hybridizes with species B, the offspring gets selected against because maybe they're weak or because they're sterile, then any change in species A that makes it less likely to mate with species B will be favored by selection. And any change in species B that makes it less likely to mate with species A will be favored by selection, because any individual that doesn't hybridize will leave more offspring than an individual that does. This is called speciation by reinforcement, also known as the Wallace effect. So here's a case of it from 2007. On the left, you have the collared flycatcher. I believe these are European birds. On the left is the collared flycatcher. On the right is the pied flycatcher. And when these hybridize, the female hybrids are sterile. I think the males can function, can have babies, but the female hybrids are sterile. So if you're a collared flycatcher and you make babies with a pied flycatcher, half of your offspring will not reproduce. If you're a collared flycatcher and you make babies with another collared flycatcher, all of your offspring will reproduce, or at least potentially can. And the same is true in the other direction. If you're a pied flycatcher and you mate with a collared, half of your offspring will be sterile and won't pass on your genes. So the idea is that anything that signals more clearly what species you are and what species you prefer is going to be favored by selection. And this seems to work. Where the two overlap, the species are more different, both in male plumage and in female preferences. In areas where the two overlap, females of each species more strongly prefer their own, and males of each species look more different from each other. Males of each species have to set themselves apart more than they do if they're the only species that's present. So that seems to be a case of speciation by reinforcement. Selection against hybrids tends to make species become more different from each other. Once speciation has gone a certain distance, reinforcement can drive those populations farther apart. That's the idea. So much for speciation by reinforcement. I'll give you one last thing to think about before we end this. You can have several of these barriers operating at once. Up there at the top is a domestic cat, Felis domesticus. Felis lies around the house and eats expensive cat food all the time, icus. And domestic cats have been bred with a wild cat native to Africa called the serval. There's a serval down there. Um, servals were actually domesticated in ancient Egypt, I believe. People use them for hunting. So it is possible to tame them. And somebody tried a few years ago to mate servals with domestic cats. And it was hard because, first of all, they're behaviorally isolated because servals would often refuse to mate with domestic cats, I guess because they smelled wrong or something like that. The gestation periods are different. It's 65 days for a house cat and 75 for the serval. And hybrid litters often got miscarried, born prematurely, or even some animals, humans can't do this, but some can, if the embryos are not developing right, they can absorb them back into their own bodies. And so some of these hybrid embryos got absorbed by mama's body before they ever got to be born in the first place. Cats can do that. Rabbits too, by the way. So we've got several isolating mechanisms: prezygotic, because servals would behaviorally refuse domestic cats as mates, and postzygotic, uh, because of failures of embryo development. And yet, and yet, some of the hybrids did survive, and it's been possible to breed these hybrids, and then the F1 hybrids between servals and domestic cats are just a little bit too wild to make good pets. But if you take the hybrids and you back cross them to domestic cats for a couple of generations, so you've got F3s and F4s that are maybe only 1/8 serval and 7/8 domestic cat, you get animals that look like this, that have the exotic appearance that cat fanciers like. This cat looks like a wild beast, and yet they're well enough behaved that the average cat owner can keep them as pets and not have his house completely destroyed. This is called the Savannah cat. So have we got one species or two? There's the rub. Reproductive isolation is not necessarily absolute. And this is an example, and there's cases of this happening in the wild as well. This is an example of what we call introgression, where genes from what we usually consider one species trickle into the gene pool of another species through occasional hybridization events. This is a case where some serval DNA has introgressed into the domestic cat population. And this is one of those things that happens. You can have two entities like these that look differently, behave differently, and don't normally interbreed. And yet, every so often, you can get DNA from one species finding its way into another, because reproductive isolation is not an all or nothing business. It's not either complete interfertility or complete intersterility. And this is just one of those things that happens. And the last point I'll make is that this is exactly what we would expect in a population or in a world of biological evolution. When I was in grad school, I used to have these debates on campus. You know how at UCA, maybe once a year, we'll get a traveling squad of missionaries that will go up on the steps of the chapel and start screaming about homosexuals and lesbians and whatever it is that they're on about. That usually happens about once a year. And at University of California, Berkeley, we got that every day. And there was this one guy named Pastor Glenn, and I used to debate evolution with him, just in front of the lunchtime crowd on the steps of Sproul Hall. And one of his arguments against evolution was that if evolution was true, we'd have no way of classifying living things and everything would just look like chaos. And I think my response was, that's the first thing you've said right. Because in a world where evolution is happening, we ought to have lots of cases where two populations are mostly different and they're almost separate species, but maybe not quite. And we have two populations that are mostly the same because they do sometimes interbreed, but sometimes they don't. So they're mostly not the separate species, but maybe kind of sort of are. And two populations that are kind of in between. And it could go either way, that maybe they're separate and maybe they aren't. We ought to find cases like this. And in fact, we do find cases like this. A fact of living on a world where the biosphere is evolving is the fact that classifying things into species is messy and fuzzy. And you have to be able to tolerate a certain amount of ambiguity to do it. And this is one of those ambiguous cases where we have two entities that look different, behave different, can't successfully interbreed very often, and yet a little bit of DNA from one has managed to trickle into another. This is introgression, and it's just one of those things that happens on a world where evolution is taking place. So the very fact that it is often very difficult to divide living things into species is actually pretty good evidence that evolution is in fact taking place. Um, and if you ever meet Pastor Glenn, you can tell him that for me. Although last I heard, he was very old and in very poor health and had kind of retired from the campus evangelism game. Anyway, Pastor Glenn, wherever you are, if you ever see this, thank you. You made my arguments for evolution stronger. Ha, right. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now.